Hello, gentlemen. How are you? Can everyone hear me properly? Are we actually live? My screen isn't lying to me, I hope. Just 1 second, I've realized that I have massively failed to actually shield myself properly. One momento, please. Live now. There we go. You'll forgive me if I'm not in an obsessive hurry to get into this topic because, my goodness, it is just horrifying. It actually hurts me to read some of this stuff that I've been reading because, oh boy. One second, is my stupid VPN still on? No, it is not. There we go. This is really annoying. There we go. Hello, Thrang. How are you? Allow me to just show myself on Twitter. I'm live talking about why about the great forces trying to ensure that you are ensure that you are not you no longer are fun. There we go. So this is probably the most research that I've ever done for a stream before, and it's a case of I still have tabs open doing research right up. The last 3 or 4 hours has just been me going over stuff that I've been reading casually for the last week or two and realizing just how much of an absolute hell I was getting into. I installed several extensions to my browser just to help me keep track of some of the stuff that I was looking into, and I would say there's a good grief. There's enough material here for like 3 or 4 streams at minimum, but I'll try and keep it reasonably on topic for the most part. I actually do have a structure for this particular stream, and it consists mainly of several different parts. The first part, I think, is going to be the instigating incident of this whole tangent thing. And then I'm going to be discussing my personal views on the topic a little bit, and after that we're going down I'm dragging you all down the rabbit hole with me. The rabbit hole of all the research that I've been reading, of the articles that I've been reading. There's at least 2 or 3 primary medical studies that I'm going to be reading through. I've got extensive notes in the form of highlights of them. They started out quite interesting, and then about half to 3/4 of the way through, they started to get me so unbelievably angry. I mean, you've seen that I've tweeted like once or twice about this while I've been doing it, and like the last kind of few things that I was doing, oh man, that Sam Hyde quote about these people having names and addresses springs to mind. Because that's kind of how I feel. This is an excellent topic to research if you want to start glowing. And I don't mean glowing subtly. I mean glowing with the brightness of a small sun. And this is just one facet of the stuff that I've looked into. There's multiple different facets that I might look into at a later point. It depends how far we get in this particular stream and how far I feel like going into it. Is he making a voodoo doll? Are they for self-gratification purposes? No, nothing like that. It does seem that people are obsessed with turning me into a certain kind of person, which I politely reject. I know that Denna is working on something, but I reject the label that I have been given publicly, and I live the way that I choose, so it probably won't affect me. But anyway, there's unfortunately not going to be much time for the fun and happy stuff. Now, for some extra context to start things off, let me just check and make sure that my tabs are properly working. Give me 1 second. Yeah, this is... that's not what I want right this instant. Yeah, here we are. Good. So that works too. Excellent. But this is the inciting incident for this wonderful stream that we are going on right this instant. About 2 weeks ago, as I was coming home from church, actually, I was looking up something on my phone. And my phone is one of the rare places where things can actually be advertised to me because I barely use it, so I haven't really installed AdBlock on it. And I just happened to notice there was it said it has a trending searches page, like Opera Mobile has a trending searches page on mobile. Sorry about that. And I happened to look, and I saw this name that I had never seen before, and that name was Lauren Hoeve. And it was right at the very top of the trending searches, and I was just curious enough to go, okay, what on earth is this talking about? Oh, hello, Denna. Nice to see you. If only I actually made it shorter. No, thank you. I am that. I'm not going to say it is completely impossible for me to stream with a femboy PNG just for the joke, but shorter, sorry, that is a step far too far in the wrong direction, and I have already been pinged. No, there we go. So Lauren Hoeve is, as this article says, she is an autistic Dutch woman who died at home by assisted suicide with her parents and best friend by her side, after sharing a harrowing final message to her online followers. Lauren Hoeve from the Netherlands was diagnosed with ME, which is also referred to chronic fatigue syndrome, in 2019. We're going to come back to that in a few seconds. She also began to experience post-exertional malaise, where she would struggle with extreme nausea, pain, and fatigue, which she described as absolute torture on X, formerly known as Twitter. This is kind of absurd. I really hate this kind of thing. Did they just link? Oh no, it does actually say that. She was also diagnosed with ADHD, and she began publicly documenting her journey to euthanasia, and her parents confirmed she passed away peacefully last Saturday after a 4-year battle with ME, so she was around for a while. On her blog Brain Fog, Lauren explained how her GP told her he respected her wish to be euthanized but could not do it himself because of her psychological conditions. So another interesting data point right there. She was put on a waiting list for an appointment with a euthanasia specialist. The fact there are euthanasia specialists out there is terrifying to me on many levels. She met with several doctors who concluded she was mentally competent for making the decision to be euthanized. 7,800 X followers. And then she wrote on her blog, I choose to make the date and time public because you have all been so excited for this moment with me. I know from experience how supportive it can be to know when it is happening so that you can reflect on it for a moment or light a candle if you wish. She wrote, this will be my last tweet. Thanks for the love, everyone. I'm going to rest a bit more and be with my loved ones. Enjoy a last morbid meme from me. I mean, I will say that this is... I mean, it's kind of morbidly entertaining in a way. It's absolutely terrifying. I don't really have much to say here. I feel that anything that I could say would be disrespectful. This is just such clown world stuff. Proctor doesn't want to draw the sexual attraction of Rie. That's also a good point, Thrang. I definitely do not want Phase Connects Princess. That's one Twitter DM I don't want to receive, okay? Now I've lost my tab already. There we go. Now let's scroll down a bit. 1.5 million X users saw this. And then one replied, thank you for sharing your journey to this farewell and for you the beginning of peace that you long for. Have a beautiful last few hours. I think of you and the people around you and wish you beautiful last moments. I noticed that none of these are along the lines of you have so much to live for or anything like this. She wrote, please know that we have done everything realistically possible to find a way out. She still wanted to get so much out of life, but she doesn't want to live to be 30 years old like this, let alone 60 or 80 years. And on her blog, Lauren said she always felt stuck in life as a result of her autism, ADHD, and ME. Now, these three things are very interesting to me, and it's also why I stuck with this topic the way it is, because one of my cousins actually has ME. I'm pretty sure they don't have autism because the autism is very much a condition from my father that is passed down to me, and he shares no direct relations with my cousin or anything. But one of my family has ME, and it is a very unpleasant condition. But the thing is that she's not in any way suicidal, trust me. She's about 35 or so, maybe a bit older than that. So she is considerably older than this woman who died at age 30. And she's also from a very low-income family that relies quite a bit on government assistance because her parents are quite old, and her father suffers from severe clinical depression. All I want to know, was she an organ donor? That's actually a very interesting point, Ducato, that I have not actually thought of. That's definitely something that I could look into as well. I remember when euthanasia specialists used to be called serial killers. Yeah, Arclight. That's kind of we're going to be seeing a lot of that morbid humor, if there's any humor in this scene whatsoever. Literally the S_icicle booth from Futurama. WTF? Yeah, I know. This is absolutely terrifying to me. Now, she wrote, "Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. It's completely okay to say that you don't know something, that you haven't studied something yet to form an opinion. It's also okay to admit when you've done something wrong. We're all human and are constantly learning. Being able to admit mistakes is a beautiful quality, and I always appreciate in people." Was urging her readers to invest in a good mattress and pillow. Lauren also recommended writing down any compliments or loving messages they receive that they can return to when they are feeling less emotionally strong. Now, this I thought was a very interesting slant for a Daily Mail article, and I've looked up multiple articles about her life and about her last few years. So I'm just picking the Daily Mail because it's literally just the first result that I saw when I searched her name again. But I've read maybe 4 or 5 different articles all talking about her end-of-life treatment and so on. And this is a recurring theme throughout, in that she was a very positive person. She is not like... well, I mean, let's say that somebody of a, shall we say, progressive mentality committed unalive. I'm not even sure if I can even say the S word on YouTube any longer, because YouTube is monumentally terrible in that regard. But let's say a major female progressive figure decided to commit die.exe. And the media caught that story. I can bet you that somewhere in there you would see something like, her condition was exacerbated by the endless amount of harassment she received as a marginalized individual. She was subjected to constant death threats and all this nonsense. And yet this woman has, how much did she say? Like 1.5 million X users. I think she said she doesn't have that many followers, but... So this woman and her journey towards assisted dying was extremely public, and she obviously interacted with people on the internet a great deal, and yet here she is saying stuff that you would never see coming out of a more left-leaning individual's mouth. She says that people were supportive of her, they were helpful to her, they were nice to her, and she got enough compliments and loving messages that she could write them down and keep a record and track of them. So it seems to me as if the reaction to everything to do with her euthanasia was incredibly supportive and incredibly helpful. And it's not really relevant so much to the topic, but I do find it interesting how in a case like this, the news articles are all emphasizing what a wonderful community all the online people that talked about her were, as opposed to the kind of stuff they normally talk about whenever it is, shall we say, convenient for their narratives to do so. But that's really beside the point. I do find it just absolutely horrible. This person did have access to so much love and support, and yet still chose to end her life the way that she did. And she also was active on YouTube, and this was a video that she posted on the internet before, I'm not sure, yeah, 2 weeks ago. So this was just before she decided to die. And it says what it says, 1 second, 1 second of videos that she took every day. And I'm just going to mute this because I have no idea if I'll get content struck or something. But I'm just going to play this, and I want you to tell me if you see any interesting facts about her existence with this condition. Like this is January. This is the middle of, oh my goodness, the Netherlands is a nice place in winter. So this gives you like a glimpse of the kind of life that she was leading before she decided to take euthanasia. McDonald's, of course. And I think almost immediately you can see what I consider to be a fairly massive issue and problem, and it creates an awful lot of serious mental dissonance in me to see. Sorry, let me just adjust my system, because I've got my laptop open where I can see, and I'm wearing gloves at the moment because it's really cold, so it's actually quite hard for me to see the chat. One moment. And the thing that I constantly see when I watch this video is that this is a woman who, for all of her physical disabilities and her problems, she is living in a very nice part of the world. She is living with, I mean, look at that house. I mean, the house that she is in it's very clean. The neighborhood is obviously very good. You can see they've got cats outside and everything. There's no, I mean, that's an incredibly clean house. She has, something like a big TV. She has animals. So she is living, I would say, a very comfortable middle income lifestyle. And I can't help but contrast that to the many stories. I mean, look at that. This is a beautiful neighborhood. This is a beautiful neighborhood. She lives in a beautiful part of the world. And yet she chose to kill herself. There's no getting around that. And I fully understand that her condition was probably extremely physically unpleasant and unbearable even. You can describe that. But to me, the idea of having, there's more examples of how her living conditions were. That when you have this much physical support in the world, why would you want to die? I'm going to stop here because this is like 8 minutes long. That I know people who are in far worse situations than this woman. They suffer from mental disorders. They suffer from severe physical disorders. Sorry about the dogs barking if you can hear that. And yet they still choose to persevere despite all of those problems. And the thing about when I started doing research on this topic, I looked into, because this woman is in the Netherlands. I originally said she was from Denmark when I was first discussing her in another stream, but I have since learned that she was from the Netherlands. The Netherlands has an extremely, shall we say, progressive attitude towards assisted dying. And that's what started me down this rabbit hole of the changing attitudes towards the entire concept of assisted dying, and how it went from something that was completely and totally unacceptable to something that was acceptable in a relatively short period of time. And I looked up a fair number of sources about it, and principally, one of the things that I want to make sure that people understand is that I don't want to come at this from an extremist's perspective. That a lot of what I researched was extremely worrying and disturbing to me, but there is also an awful lot of what I would define as a moral panic around situations like this, and I dislike that because I have a very strong attitude that if you are feeling passionate and if you are feeling as if something is very negative, then and you're engaging with it as a concept, you need to have a very firm understanding of what it actually is, because you can go after something you feel is bad with the best of intentions, but you can actually make the situation much worse, and you can provide your enemies, who you don't want to succeed, with more ammunition if your attack upon them is poorly formatted and you don't make your case well enough. Why was this recommended? I don't know. I have no idea how I have higher than 10 CCV at the moment. Also, assisted suicide increases because we're in a godless world. I mean, I would agree, but I think there's a lot more to it. And the whole godless world thing, I think, is a very important point to make. And this is why the first part of this is going to be like this. Let me just bring up, let me see, no, not that one, this one. Is that I'm actually going to be using this to take a couple of notes. One second, let me get my drawing tablet onto my lap. It is currently very cold. I am very heavily wrapped up at the moment. I have gloves on. I have a very, very, very thick and extremely comfortable dressing gown on over a fleece, and I've got 2 layers of trousers on as well. So manual dexterity is not my greatest asset right this instant. Let me just check to make sure my pen is properly working. Yes, it is. So I just want to start things off with maybe a bit of a Blackboard presentation. Right up here, personal perspectives. Because I have lived an interesting life, shall we say, with interesting people. And let me just move the microphone a little bit closer. And I'm also, well, for one thing, I'm quite a religious person. I have a very strong personal Christian faith, and that influences my attitude on this topic of assisted dying very significantly. But also, I have a lot of people in my life who would in some way be affected by the idea of assisted dying, and I'm going to be, if any of you are betting on how long it's going to take me to bring up my mother in this video, well, guess what? I'm bringing up my mother very quickly, and I'm trying not to look at the handwriting that I just did because it's already triggering my OCD massively. So as I mentioned, I was affected by Lauren Hoeve's story because I do have a cousin who suffers from serious serious ME. Close communication and religion is the best cures against depression. So yeah, assisted suicide is actually the result of a godless world. I mean, that's a pretty good summary about that. Proctor, are you going to talk about how the push for people to kill themselves in European countries is just another step of the Great Replacement? I mean, I kind of thought of doing so, but I actually got quite a lot of information regarding physician perspectives and so on that I think is very important to discuss. Again, I have a massive amount of material to go over. I have no idea how long this stream will be, but we're going to cover quite a lot. And to start off, I'm not going to try and I am going to get through this, is that, like, to me, oops, that's not what I meant to do. So for me, there's the whole Christian upbringing aspect of it, because I don't know how many people understand what the biblical or Christian perspective on suicide is, but it's fairly negative overall. The idea, in a nutshell, is that, you know, life is a gift from God, and if you decide to take away life, then you're essentially saying to God that you don't agree with the gift that He's given you. Which let me just adjust that S. Let me just, I will sacrifice my hand to the cold and take off the glove and I'm in a support splint at the moment because my wrist has been quite painful. I suffer from joint pains quite a bit at this time of year because my joints, unfortunately, are very sensitive to both cold and damp, which is wonderful. There. So we have the Christian upbringing on one hand, so you can call that a very strong incentive to be naturally against the idea of suicide or assisted dying or anything like that. But also, one of the major things that is an influence in my life is my mother, who has very serious medical conditions. And you see, my mother is somebody who became a Christian only after spending quite a few years as what you might call like a libertarian. She was very leftist, very libertarian orientated before she became pregnant, had children, and realized that there's more to life than that. And but she has always had a very strong influence on what you might call dignity. Now, currently, she suffers from cancer. She has blood cancer, and she also has several other major conditions on top of that. And she's always had a very strong attitude that death is a personal choice, is that ultimately, because the way the world is, you can't really have complete control over anything in your life aside from how you die. And she's facing an issue in her life where within the next few years, she may well physically decay to the point where her life is no longer possible to live independently. And she's currently on chemotherapy. Fortunately, it is fairly light chemotherapy, so it does not adversely affect her. But she has already made the decision that if her condition gets to the point where, let me just add this, where she is no longer capable of leading an independent life, her reaction to that will simply be to stop taking her medication and allow herself to die naturally. And that's something that she has expressed to me on several levels, and I agree with her perspective. I think that it is very wrong to what's happened to my thing. I think has my creator just crashed. I think my creator has just crashed. That's very bloody annoying. Yep, it's completely frozen up. That's tremendous. Thank you so much, creator. Okay, let me just go back to just chatting. That was an effort that ended quickly. I'm not going to bother trying to. I'm not going to bother trying to troubleshoot that now. It's probably because I was using a different form of capture for the stupid creator thing. Yeah, in summary, Christian upbringing, mother, and who has medical conditions, who has decided that if her condition ever gets too serious, she will decide to end her own life on her own terms. And I do think that that is incredibly important for all of society to understand that, on the one hand, nobody can tell you to keep living. I think that this is another thing that I have discussed with her very extensively, that she has always imparted to me the understanding that because of her more liberal upbringing and her very much naturalistic beliefs, apart from traditional Christianity, that she believes that it is wrong, it is both morally and in some ways economically wrong to demand that society aggressively facilitate your desire to stay alive after you have reached a point in your life where you are taking more out of society than you are capable of giving back to society. And I would overall agree with her on that prospect. I feel that it is important for people to consider not just the quality of their own lives, but the quality of other people's lives if they choose to continue living. I see too many cases of people who are obviously so scared of the idea of dying that they are willing to go to extreme lengths to preserve their lives in a state where they are taking away enormous amounts of resources, both from themselves, but even for their children, just in order to continue an existence where the only positive is the fact that it hasn't ended. I'm talking about people who have absolutely terminal cancer and yet are put on very high level life support systems for days or weeks or months so that they live that extra few weeks, extra year or so in excruciating pain and with no real quality of life, but they simply refuse to allow death to take them because they feel as if they're not prepared for what comes after. And that's a real contrast. I think that this almost fixation on being alive at absolutely any cost is a product of today's society, because I am very exposed to elderly people in my life. Like, my parents are both very elderly, and the vast majority of social contacts that I have outside of YouTube and the internet are elderly, because I really enjoy speaking to older people, because I feel as if they have perspectives and a level of intellect on life that I would say the last two generations simply haven't had. I mean, I have better and more intellectual conversations with 70-year-olds than I have with 20-year-olds, and I think that's a pretty damning indictment on the way that society is at this point. And I find that the older, when you go back like 2 or 3 generations, people's attitudes towards death are vastly different than they are today. People tend to be far more realistic about dying. All the elderly people that I know in my, like, the local men's club have this attitude towards dying that is, well, I hope that I'm happy on the day that I die, and if I'm happy most days, then I don't care what day that I die. And it's funny, I went into the club about 2 weeks ago, and there was a guy there who had died maybe a few days before, and I had no awareness of this, and I would have thought that they would have had a great big funeral for him and everything, but all that had happened was these guys who were all in their 70s were just sitting around saying, wow, that guy, he was so fortunate to die when he did. He died of a heart attack a day after going to this amazing party, and we remember him laughing and smiling and being happy, and he just went home, he went to bed, and he didn't wake up the next morning. We think that's great. We're happy for the life that he lived. And that's a very standard attitude that I find that older generations have towards the idea of dying. And also, I think that in some ways we have a two-edged sword in modern society, in that medical treatment is vastly better than is vastly better than it was in those older generations. And that is a good thing in many ways, but an economic reality that we face these days is that people who would otherwise have died, say, in their early, mid-70s, now have the medical facilities to live on far longer than that. And they tend to get much worse diseases that are then treatable and that can be delayed, but not in a way that adds to their quality of life. I mean, I remember a lot of elderly people in my life remember when diseases like influenza and so on were considered almost a good thing for an old person to get. Because when an old person, somebody in their 70s or 80s, got influenza, it was almost always a death sentence. Influenza is a tremendous killer of the elderly, but it also tended to kill elderly people fairly suddenly, of telling them that their time was up, and that this was a relatively quick and easy way for them to exit out of life without hanging around and being a burden on large numbers of people. I remember my dad told me if he were to die, he wants everyone to be happy and throw a party remembering the good times. Yeah, that is absolutely and exactly the kind of attitude that these old guys in this place, in this men's club, have. In that when there's on their wall, they have pictures of all the people who have died in their club. And pretty much all of them will talk about them fondly. You don't ask them, and they don't say, oh, it was terrible. I remember being at his bedside. We were all crying. It was dreadful. No, the vast majority of them are just like, oh, yeah, that guy. I remember him. He was a great guy. He killed himself trying to jump over a 5-barred gate when he was 75. It was such a laugh. And It's this acceptance that death is something that happens to you after a certain point in life, whereas today death is regarded as a terrifying specter that is something to be fought against at any cost, regardless of how miserable your existence is as you crawl along from day to day. I don't agree with that. So, to sum that up, I believe that if a person decides it is time for them to die, and they are fairly elderly, and for example, they have a fatal illness and they've decided that their quality of life has decreased to the point that there is no longer any purpose in their existence, then they should be allowed to simply stop taking medication and they should be allowed to pass on peacefully. And that is a right that has been upheld by many court decisions, is that many children have gone, no, I don't want you to go, I want you to stay around as long as possible. And they've even taken their parents to court to try and get them to continue living. And their parents have been like, no, I choose when I go out. And pretty much every court has said, nah, exactly, they choose when they go out. And I think that's perfectly fine. Unfortunately, we live in a world where, I'm not sure how to describe this, that people seem to have lost perspective and focus on what a good life actually is. And there are many societal factors at play which encourage people to think of life as having no meaning and no quality, even when it objectively does have quality. And that's what struck me so much about this case of Lauren Hoeve, is that from my perspective, looking at her videos, she had an immense amount of positive influences on her life. Her physical capacity was very low. She was obviously a very sick woman, and I can understand if she wanted to die on that basis. But at the same time, it shocks me to my core that she was living in such lovely circumstances with so much support and so much help, and yet she was still unable to find reasons to keep living, and indeed was unable to find reasons to keep living for 5 years before she actually got euthanized. And when somebody like that is surrounded by such comfort for 5 whole years, and at the end of those 5 years still chooses to terminate their own existence, it really gets something inside of me that it gets my noggin a jogging. It gets me worried, like deeply worried about the way that society is. And that's why I've been doing all of this research, which I will now just go over quickly. Although, Before we do continue, there is something rather funny that was linked to me in, it's not really funny, but it is, I did derive a little bit of morbid entertainment from it. I think I've got everything set back up. Yes, I do. Here it is. The former Dutch Prime Minister Dries van Acht, I'm gonna butcher that name, I'm sorry, and his wife die hand in hand by euthanasia at age 93. Now this, I just want to say that I am completely okay with this. Well, I'm not necessarily okay with the euthanasia aspect of it, but at 93, I would say that you're pretty well, that if a 93-year-old told me I'm okay with dying by somebody else's hand, then I'd be like, you know what, you've lived a perfectly good life, you seem to be fine, so I accept that that's a perspective you can have. But it did just kind of entertain me that he died with his wife, who was also euthanized at the same time. And it says he was a Christian Democrat, but he became increasingly progressive, and the two had both fragile health for some time. In 2019, Van Acht suffered a brain hemorrhage while giving a speech at a commemoration event for Palestinians and never fully recovered. Following a visit to Israel in 1999, he became increasingly vocal about his support for the Palestinian people. He referred to his experience of the trip as a conversion. And I just find it highly entertaining that he's literally done what a vast number of people are unironically saying that people in Europe should do. He killed himself so that other people could have his resources. And I don't think that he shouldn't have been allowed to do this, but it touches on something that I've seen so many people express an attitude of, that there are people out there who unironically believe that their existence is a bad thing because they are taking something away from less abled people. And I don't agree with that on many levels. I think that it's your responsibility to find ways to contribute in life to prevent you from going out of it. One nanosecond, please. My laptop's trackpad is very, very annoying to manipulate. There we go. Sorry about that. With gloves on. And we can now move on to the first... Actually, we can't move on because I just need to blow my nose. 2 seconds, please. There we go. My apologies. So this is the first of 1, 2, 3... Yeah, at least 3 studies that I've looked up and I've read fairly extensively. You can tell because I've got several highlights of this. And this is a qualitative study on existential suffering and assisted suicide in Switzerland. And I thought this was a very relevant and important study to analyze because, as I've highlighted here, this study explores the perspectives of care professionals and volunteers from a Right to Die organization on existential suffering as a motive for assisted suicide requests. And in Switzerland, people can be granted access to assisted suicide on condition the person whose wish to die performs the fatal act, that he has his decisional capacity, and that the assisting person's conduct is not selfishly motivated. No restrictions related to the ground of suffering are mentioned in the Act. Existential suffering as a reason for wanting to die, however, gives rise to controversial issues. And right here, this no restrictions related... I'm not sure why I didn't highlight this. That no restrictions related to the ground of suffering are mentioned in this Act. And I posted this on Twitter. It is completely terrifying to me on multiple levels that these laws have been passed that enable assisted suicide. And in Switzerland, it's actually fairly conservative in terms of what it allows you to do, because it says that that a physician cannot assist a person who wishes to die. A person must do it to themselves, basically commit suicide. This is not even technically assisted dying, but it is very relevant to the discussion. But what is astonishing to me is that now, after these laws have been passed, people are going back and they are saying, we don't have any data to actually support the kind of legislation that has already been acted. We don't actually know what we're really talking about. And here it is, and here it says the 26 participants described existential suffering in a multiplicity of individual ways, and they talk about 63 different stories, that is, people who requested assisted dying. These are the stories that they told the participants of this study as explanations of why they wanted to die. And it gives each of them in and you can see I've highlighted stuff quite extensively. It gives various different categories of why people wanted to die, and I want to go through these one by one because the commentary on them is quite interesting. Let's go to the top. Here it is. The acceptability of requests for AS motivated by existential suffering are controversial. This controversy is rendered more difficult by vagueness regarding what people understand the definition of existential suffering to be. So the problem here is that people are requesting to die, and the judges of whether or not they should be allowed to die have no real understanding of what the criteria actually is. Here, like the blue stuff is stuff that I find interesting. The pink highlight is stuff I find scary. There is no consistency on how to evaluate or treat being tired of life or distress that leads people to want to commit assisted suicide. There's a recent article reviewed the definition of existential suffering and suggested that it could be understood as an incapacitating state of despair resulting from an inner realization that life is futile and without meaning. So again, this is a recent paper that is discussing this idea. So they have not even formed a firm idea of what it is they're going to define the desire for assisted suicide as, which is just insane for me. Sorry, 1 second, I need a drink. I don't understand why you would want to volunteer to suicide if your life is going good. Yeah. He's just like the downed fox muting us to prevent us from hearing nose guys. Yes, I'm sorry, you're not getting it. I remember when Kirsha actually did blow her nose on stream without muting, and she was so upset. She was so embarrassed by it. She was like apologizing profusely to her chat about it, and everybody was like, no, do it more. Gonna take every opportunity for laughs that I can in this. They also pointed out the difficulty in distinguishing existential suffering from spiritual concerns or from psychological symptoms such as depression. So only 3 conditions in Switzerland are needed to access AS. I've already discussed that actually, so I won't go through it. It says here, in 2016, 928 people died from assisted suicide in Switzerland, and a 2013 study showed that physician-assisted death counted for 1.1% of all deaths in the country. And here's another thing that is horrifying to me. Professional definitions of existential suffering were examined in 2004, but to our best knowledge, no study has been performed about their perspectives when this existential pain or suffering is part of the request for AS in a country where it is legal. Moreover, no study has been conducted to see how these people confront it, how they actually manage this kind of suffering. This is the point. This was one of the first papers that I actually read in research for this stream, and it was this was the first time that I just sat there for about 30 or 40 seconds, fully absorbing what I had just read. And this is the basis for their study. This is why, in the context of this particular legislation, we asked care professionals and volunteers from a Right to Die organization, Exit Suisse Romande, who are confronted to assisted suicide. The grammar in this article is not the best, by the way. It may be a bit weird, because I'm pretty sure it's translated. About their experiences regarding existential suffering as being the reason for the request. And again, if you think about this for more than a few seconds, the horrifying aspects of it just become abundantly clear. That these people are right to die advocates, and they actively assist people in finding ways to end their lives. And yet nobody has ever sat down with them and asked them what their criteria are. Nobody has provided them with clarifying insight into how to deal with people who may desire assisted suicide for one reason or another. It's just unbelievable to me. I can't get over it. And it made me more insane as time went by, because I realized that every paper that I read said basically the same thing. That we started legislating this before we had any concrete data on it at all. And this stuff is just data analysis, so it's not particularly interesting. And this is when they talk about the results. This is the first major interesting bit that we're having a long conversation about. And this is professionals' perspectives on existential suffering as a reason for requesting assisted suicide. 1 second. And they say here, they described existential suffering in a multiplicity of very individual ways. They recounted 67 stories. Most of them described life that wasn't worth living any longer. So we've already covered that fairly simply. So first of all, they describe physical decline, which I'm not going to dwell on too much because I've already made my feelings on that quite fairly clear. And this is a classic example of somebody describing a patient who has anal incontinence. And she's obviously extremely elderly. She's already blind, deaf. She can't move anymore. In a case like this, I would be 100% in favor of a person deciding to die. I think that if they're fairly elderly, then it's reasonable for them to have made the decision that they want to pass on, and that it's not the right of a person to say, no, you have so much to live for when somebody is in this condition. If their conditions are incurable and there is no possibility of them making a recovery, like, that's okay. And most of the participants considered physical decline as being a trigger for existential suffering, in that it induces dependency, pain, loss of pleasurable activities, hurt self, or loss of hope. So this is a fairly common thing that most of the participants tended to agree on. And here's this quote: "I had the feeling that for this woman, beyond a certain limit, it was no longer acceptable to live. She was too damaged, too dependent, you could see it. So she preferred stepping down before becoming too dependent on nursing." And I think this is a very dignified attitude. I think this woman was very mature. I think that her words were rational and sensible. So I don't think there is any cause for any kind of concern for this particular category of people just deciding that their lives should not continue. But here is an important point that was made. Participants also pointed out the fact that dependency can induce a diminished perception of someone's own image, and that suffering originates from this feeling. Hurt self, one of the codes in this category, is illustrated in the following example. The caregivers also play an important role because they are frequently confidants of patients during bathing, physical activities, etc. It's often here that patients talk about their suffering regarding loss of autonomy, aka their physical decline. It's often what we hear. One's self-image plays an important role in this kind of decision. Patients often tell us, "I don't recognize myself." And this, I think, is a critical point because it's highlighting the role that caregivers are supplying. And there was another, I'm not sure if I don't know exactly where it was, but there was another data point that I will bring up later on, which highlights the attitude of psychologists and psychiatrists compared to people with more hands-on interactions with people who request assisted suicide. And I think that this is an important point because it shows that the people who are, I would say, are most qualified to externally determine whether somebody is rationally making a decision for assisted death are the caregivers who interact with that person on a daily basis. I do not think that a psychologist should have the ability to determine whether somebody is qualified for assisted suicide, because that goes into a whole can of worms that I will talk about later on. There is a relevant element. It's often the illness, that severe illness, interpret into these people's life, and this constituted a threshold. And rightly, there often is a fracture between the before of who I was once and the now, where people often take an ill person identity, and their identity is now limited to the issue of being ill, which is another very important thing. And I want to contrast this with my mother again, because one of my mother's strongest sources of self-worth and self-identity is her ability to contribute to the family, and her ability to lead an independent life. And this is something that she has talked to me about quite extensively, in that she refuses the definition of an ill person. She refuses to be considered as somebody who is ill. And she says that by refusing that definition, she automatically blocks out a vast amount of negative self-thought, negative perception about herself. Because so long as her attitude is that I am a person and I am capable of doing things, then that instantly blocks all dwelling on misery. It blocks depression. It blocks the kind of attitude where she starts to consider reasons why she wouldn't want to continue living any longer. And that inherent positivity has served her incredibly well, and it's another reason why I find it very distressing to see people who are in fairly decent physical condition and who are leading fairly nice lives in good conditions just deciding for themselves that they are no longer worth, that life is no longer worth living. I respectfully disagree with their perception, and I think that they are indulging in, they're basically saying these are all the reasons why I should die, instead of these are all the reasons why my life is still worth living. Just back at chat for a second. So they don't care to ask. That's a red flag. Yeah, I agree. I do think so. And I think the perspective on these conversations is very important. That if you go into, and I think this is a mistake that psychologists make. They go into these conversations with patients trying to determine the reasons why they want to die. Whereas I think it should be completely the opposite. I think the conversations to somebody who desires assisted suicide should not be about why they want to die, but should instead be encouraging them to find reasons to continue living. Now, if you've done that and they still say, I'm sorry, I think that on an objective basis, my life is no longer worth living, I think that you should respect that person's decision to choose to end their own life on their own terms. But I feel that there is a very strong burden placed upon those who are making this assessment to go out of their way, maybe even above and beyond the call of duty, as it were, to try and help people to find reasons to keep living. Because the moment you go, okay, death is a possibility now, what are the chances of you dying? Then you've changed the perspective in a very negative and dangerous way. Because again, as a Christian, my attitude is that death is an enemy, and that death is a negative human condition that should not be given into, that by finding reasons to continue living, you are essentially saying to God, I cherish your gift of life to such a degree that I am willing to continue living despite adversity and problems, because I understand there is no greater gift than that of life itself. And here's another bit of red highlighting. I'm convinced that the way society perceives these people who are not productive anymore, with cognitive trouble, these people becoming a financial burden, and the ones becoming diminished or incontinent is a problem. And this is a very insightful comment that I think is very much worthy of analysis, because it goes back to what I was saying earlier, in that I mix with a lot of elderly people who, by associating with themselves in a very positive and upbeat manner, they push away this perspective that they are not productive, in that they devote a large portion of their elderly lives to finding reasons to become more productive and reinforcing the belief in each other that their lives are not yet over, even when they're in their 80s, sometimes even 90s, that there are more reasons to keep living. Because again, the moment you flip things around to, oh, these are all the reasons why you should die, then you're committing a very dangerous psychological error. And I'm sure there's a psychological term for it. It's the difference between optimism and pessimism. The kind of people that I know who are elderly tend to be very optimistic, whereas these people, a lot of the assisted suicide stuff just tends towards pessimism as opposed to optimism. And I don't agree with that at all. And here is one of the most important parts. The purple highlighting is stuff that I found completely critical and essential in every way. Loneliness was the second most mentioned component of existential suffering, with nearly 2/3 of participants talking about it. According to many participants, loneliness seems to be a significant cause for requesting assisted suicide. And there's this quote here. I told her, I'd just like to know something honestly. If you were with children, grandchildren, would you do that? Request assisted suicide. She told me, surely not. And I told her, so, is it really because of loneliness? And she told me, yes. And this is one of the worst aspects that I see in modern society. It is the granulation of human relationships. That people do not have the natural support networks with which to find reasons to continue living. And once again, the men's club that I go to has a lot of elderly people, and by the fact they have a lot of personal contact with each other, they are able to stave off these feelings of loneliness, which are identified by this and multiple other sources as a very significant reason why people simply decide not to live any longer. Let me just back a chat for a second. A reason to live, that is what most people are missing nowadays. I completely agree with you. That is, reasons to live are in short supply these days, and it ties into all sorts of things that are a tangent that I won't focus on right now. Loneliness was often described as a loss of human contact. A hospital chaplain talked about solutions that could be proposed to people demanding AS due to existential suffering in these terms. So I think of the possibilities of activating greater human proximity, because it's actually often what is lacking. I apologize for the grammar mistakes. This lack of connection, this lack of contact, but that is also because of this what people often wanted, because they arrived to this type of loneliness. She actually referred to a kind of chosen loneliness, contrary to the one induced by the loss of a loved one. Another participant illustrates it. She didn't necessarily have pain, but it's true that her treatment was quite heavy for her, and in addition, the fact that she was deeply mourning her husband, so it's true, I don't know what exactly motivated her wish to commit suicide. And I am going to make an assumption that this woman that she's talking about either did not have children or was isolated from her children, or maybe her children just didn't really care all that much, which, is a thing that sadly happens. And people, I think that loneliness is one of the most devastating human conditions imaginable. I mean, I did an entire stream reacting to in modern society, and the granulation of people away from each other as opposed to allowing them to come together in natural ways. I was talking to a young man. Let me have a drink of water. I was talking to a young man who goes to the same church as me a week or so ago, and he has just left school. And he is a very intelligent young man, and I would say that he has a very good future ahead of him. And he was talking about career opportunities and business opportunities. And one thing that he said has stuck with me is that he pointed out that he's 18, so he just left school. He pointed out that after he left school, he realized there was essentially nowhere for him as a youth to go outside of college. He didn't intend to go to college because he felt that he was intelligent enough to make his way on his own, and I agree with that assessment. He is a very intelligent young man. That outside of college, there were no youth clubs anymore. There were no places where youth naturally met up. There were no youth cafes or anything like that, and that, I think, is a terrible thing for a culture to have, because he was looking into opportunities to actually open a youth cafe himself, and I just warned him, make sure that it doesn't become a drug dealing den. But fortunately, I think that he will have systems in place to prevent that from happening. And this is one of the massive issues that modern society faces, is that young people especially are brought up with the idea of loneliness embedded in them, because they go to school where they rarely make friends and they're often bullied. And then they leave school and they go to college where they either drop out because they can't keep up with the coursework and become just feckless hedonists, or they put their nose to the grind and devote themselves to academic accomplishment, and they don't end up forming long-term partnerships or relationships or anything like that. And so the basic systems of society are set up in such a way that this loneliness issue is incredibly prevalent. And when you combine that with a society which has basically said, it's a normal and even dignified thing to kill yourself, you have a recipe for disaster in society. No family, bread tastes word and is smaller in ration, and most circuses are terrible in preaching. That's a bit of an ESL comment, but I do understand what you're talking about. Not surprised so many feel sad and helpless. I agree. It's understandable. It's just tragic. Then, of course, we have fear of the future, which I didn't think was enormously interesting overall. I think that existential dread is something that is pretty natural to the human condition. Is another thing. But down here we have another pink highlight, life is over. This category was mentioned by more than 1/3 of the participants. Now, irritatingly, they don't describe how old these participants were. Another quote here, he tells me, do you understand? My world shrinks. You can do whatever you want. I'm assuming this is a disabled person of some... Yeah, he's 91 years old. I knew that I will soon be coming to an end. I hope everything is going to be all right and that someone will help me if not. This is an objective observation. He is 91 years old. And down here, purple highlighting, it is this category that we found what we call a kind of pure existential suffering, a suffering without identification to any other related ones. Only 4 of 26 participants talked about it, and it was described in 4 out of 63 stories. An exit volunteer illustrated it. but it concerns more the people in the retirement homes, except this woman who clearly said that she didn't want to find a spouse again and that her life was finished. That she had a beautiful life with her husband, that she raised her children, that she had grandchildren who were going well. So she had done it all and said, "So I can leave now." It sounds like this woman had accomplished what she had to, and was ready to die. No physical decline, no dependency, a little bit of loneliness maybe. And I highlight this in purple because I feel that this is the very, very edge of the slippery slope. That there are legitimate cases where people want to end their lives because they have simply done everything and there's no real prospect of them doing more. And I think that is a valid category, and the study here is very sensible for pointing it out as a potential category, as they say, a pure existential suffering, so that it's something that stands on its own. It doesn't really have relation to socio-economic factors. It's simply the objective decision that there is nothing more for me in life, so I may as well exit it with dignity. And again, I think that should be respected, but at the same time, it is the thin end of the wedge. And by quantifying this existential suffering, sorry, my apologies, you create a precedent, because you're saying to people like sociologists, psychiatrists, etc., that you can quantify the state that a person can be in where they decide that their life is no longer worth living. And as soon as you quantify something, you open it up for further study. And so now you can go out and you can research this and you can make judgments along the lines of, does this thing qualify as pure existential suffering on the same grounds as this thing? And this is where we are now, in that we have arguments that can be considered rational being made about all these other things, about all these other reasons why people should be allowed to commit assisted suicide. And I think a great deal of them stem back to this category of pure existential suffering that has been slowly but steadily expanding and used as a basis in more and more cases. Because it's saying that at some level there is a case where there is no question that your life should end, is better off ended than it is continued. But the criteria for what counts as a confirmed definition just keeps expanding. But we'll get back to that in one of the other papers. We have loss of social significance. I'm trying not to speak too fast. Loss of social significance was mentioned by 8 out of 27 participants and was equally described as a feeling of uselessness. Many participants pointed out the fact that society, our culture, might be partly responsible for these feelings, such as expressed by a primary care provider. And you have loss of hope in a better future down here as well. And this of course, ties back to, I'm not going to reiterate it yet again, but again, if people do not have access to societal spaces where they are encouraged to continue living for whatever reason, and then they are going to keep finding reasons why they shouldn't continue living. And loss of a better future, and here I have a tag here, climate emergency, childlessness, etc. And this is, it could be a whole other video, in that for the last 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, the newer generations have been bombarded with this idea that their existence is an objective deficit to the rest of the planet. And it starts as early as preschool, is that I read some absurd stuff a few months ago about how even children in preschoolers are being told that their existence is causing damage to the rest of the world. The moment that children, there are experiences where people who have just entered primary school are being told to write letters to politicians talking about climate change and the end of the world. And this is completely demented to me. This idea that you are taking people from a very young age and you are giving them this idea that their lives are not worth living. And the very fact that they are alive, they are in some way making the world worse and accelerating the end of the world. I consider that to be nothing short of child abuse, and that if people when you bring people up with those kind of concepts, then they are naturally going to look at any further problems they have in their life and go, well, one major solution is simply that I'm not here any longer, because not only would that end my suffering, it would actually be better for the rest of the world, because I have taken the stress of my existence out of other people's lives, and I have also taken that stress off the planet, whose resources I am consuming and destroying. And this is where the wedge starts to get a little bit wider, and where the commercialization of assisted dying and all of this can of worms really starts open. This is the ring pull with which you use to open the can of worms, and this is where I started getting pretty damn scared. But continuing on, we'll get back to that later. And there's loss of pleasurable activities. Life isn't worth living anymore because her condition prevented her from enjoying museum visits, which used to be the greatest pleasure in her daily life. Hence, life did not make sense to her anymore. And I highlighted this because I feel that it's an example of limited horizons. Because I feel that if you are making a decision to try and end your life simply because you can't enjoy museum visits any longer, that hints to me that your life was never particularly rich before. That people have limited horizons. And so when the prospect of ending life comes up, they just can't really think of reasons to keep on going. And that should never be a case for people choosing to die. I'm sorry. That people should be encouraged to find new reasons to keep living. They probably aren't allowed to question their decision, like affirmative care for trans people. I mean, that's a whole other cloud of worms, or can of worms, sorry. How much more of this study is there? Not too much. There's only a few more things. So on the discussion, our study found that existential suffering included physical decline and its consequences, loneliness, fear of future, etc. So basically what they're saying here is that it is a multifaceted issue. There's a lot to it. And here's another thing. In a society that gives great importance to physical appearance, as aging represents a slow loss of a cultural self-identity, because one stops to be a productive and contributing member of society, physical decline leads to an even deeper fracture of identity. And here we have a kind of a dog whistle. A form of internalized ageism could be at work in these situations. It says back here, according to our participants, society was somehow responsible, at least in part, for existential suffering. Perceptions of old age or physical decline are influenced by societal contexts. They shape the way we see ourselves, and this can lead to deep suffering. More pragmatically, lack of the sort of social support required to maintain relationships, a sense of self and well-being may have played a role as well. But it's this comment here, the form of internalized ageism, and it reminded me in a flash of a conversation I had with my very good friend Alex, which I will now go back and I will read to you, because he sent me yesterday, coincidentally, an experience, because he's an economist, and he deals with insurance claims and various other things like that. So he talks to a lot of high-level economic people, and he just gives me this experience here. It's on Discord, so I can't put it up on screen, but I will read it. A guy bemoans to me that nowhere offers pensions anymore, and he tries to frame it as an evil, greedy business trying to save a dime. And then Alex asks if he knows the life expectancy statistics for when pensions were the primary retirement asset people could be trusted to have. And surprise, surprise, the guy doesn't. And so Alex says he spends the next 10 minutes explaining why considerable improvements to life expectancy killed the pension, because most pension enjoyers used to die within 10 to 15 years of taking payments, and every pension tracks the date where an employee will have taken more than they paid in. For most people, it's around age 87. This means that current employees pay for every day the geriatric wakes up. And then he spends a little while explaining what benefits replace the pension, and he ends up handing out half a dozen business cards. And this is a major factor, is that there are many major socio-economic factors which encourage elderly people to find reasons not to live anymore. and that it is becoming increasingly difficult in the modern economic space to have money past your age of productivity. And so a large number of elderly people are trapped in situations where they have no reasons to live, not out of any personal physical issue, but simply because the economy in which they live has decided that it is time for them to die. And this is one of my major issues with the attitudes towards assisted dying, because it has this issue deeply embedded in its fabric. Now we have just a couple more comments. Our findings suggest that most suicide assistance requests for reasons of existential suffering are made by people who are indeed suffering in readily recognizable ways, and I agree with this. But again, this is also what the few data from Exit Right to Die organization on motives for AS requests tend to demonstrate. So they are saying that they believe that people who request AS are indeed suffering in readily recognizable ways, but they also highlight that there is almost no data to support this conclusion. And this was another thing I put on Twitter, because it drove me absolutely bloody insane. And before I start getting loud, let me have another drink. This year, the Swiss Academy of Medical Science, which provides healthcare professionals with recommendations on ethics issues, published new guidelines on the management of dying and death. They stated that the assisting person has to verify 5 requirements, including that the symptom of disease and/or functional impairments are a source of intolerable suffering for the patient. For the first time, the institution provided healthcare professionals with more specific requirements in terms of suffering for requesting assisted dying. And in purple, by probably providing the first in-depth published account on this studied group in this particular legal framework, our study contributes to the literature in several ways. And again, let's have a look. This study was published in May of 2019. Assisted suicide has been legal in Switzerland for years before this, and only now are they conducting these kind of studies. And look, this study has 26 participants. And if we go all the way back down here, look at what they say. It's the first in-depth published account which they expect to contribute to the literature in several ways. When your entire argument is based on a field of study where a study with 26 participants can be considered a major contribution, that is terrifying. It is completely terrifying to me. Based on our findings, we could, for example, imagine a questionnaire investigating at least these 8 categories of existential suffering. This would help care providers and volunteers from Right to Die organizations to better understand the suffering experienced by the persons they are taking care of, and in this way, help them to propose more personalized and more appropriate care. The questionnaires, guys, are going to save us all. The questionnaires are what will make the difference between life and death for potentially thousands and thousands of people. Are you understanding why my voice sounds the way it does right now? This is absolute insanity, and it is terrifying to me. But anyway, there was nothing particularly interesting about the conclusion of this. As I said, this was one of the first things that I read on this topic that was a major research thing, and it just scared me on so many levels that I had to look deeper. It's just such a rabbit hole. And it means that I can move on very quickly to, let me see what it is. Yeah. This is what, I'll just blow this up a tiny bit so that we can see it better. Yeah, there we go. That's a good size, and my avatar isn't blocking any of the text. This was another study published in 2019. Notice how recent the dates are. And this was a report of physicians' beliefs about physician-assisted suicide, a national study. This was talking to U.S. healthcare physicians. The goal of this, where in the United States, I believe that some form of assisted suicide is legal or at least not criminally persecutable in something like 11 states, I believe. Another tab here has more accurate assessments of it. And these are the initial conclusions. Our survey indicates that 60% of physicians thought PAS, that is physician-assisted suicide, should be legal. And of that 60%, 13% answered yes when asked if they would perform the practice if it were legal. 49% agreed that most patients who seek PAS do so because of pain. 58% agreed that current safeguards in place for PAS in general are adequate to protect patients. But with respect to specific safeguards, 60% disagreed with the statement that physicians who are not psychiatrists are adequately trained to screen for depression in patients seeking PAS, and 60% disagreed with the idea that physicians can predict with certainty whether a patient seeking PAS has 6 months or less to live. Finally, 1/3 of physicians thought that the legalization of PAS would lead to the legalization of euthanasia. So euthanasia is something different. This is still assisted dying or assisted suicide. And here the wedge continues to grow deeper. 48% agreed that insurance companies would preferentially cover PAS over possible life-saving treatments if PAS was legalized nationally. I'm sorry if I'm switching between PAS and PAS. Second, physicians are generally misinformed with regard to why patients seek PAS, and they are uncertain about the adequacy of safeguards, and this is where we start to see the slippery slope be actively discussed. And again, a Gallup poll indicates that 67% of the American public support legalization for PAS. And again, it says, we found that PAS is increasingly becoming legalized and is performed relatively rarely. And this is in purple text because I do not agree with this. And another source that I'm going to discuss disputes this. A national survey concluded that in 2008, about some physicians' attitudes towards PAS also revealed that highly religious physicians are more likely to oppose PAS than those with low religiosity. I hate that term, religiosity. And again, like I've said, that religious attitudes have a tremendous impact on what you think of this whole assisted suicide debate. And here was another data point, and I ranted about this a little bit on Discord too. Oncologists and hematologists, and an oncologist is a cancer specialist, and a hematologist, I believe, is a blood specialist, were least likely to support PAS, while psychiatrists were most likely. And remember, an oncologist is someone who works with cancer patients, and I want you to imagine this. An oncologist is someone who is most likely to witness the physical results of cancer. So an oncologist is someone who has probably had to tell multiple people that they should expect to live less than 5 years. And they have probably witnessed people with advanced cases of cancer lying in a hospital bed with multiple tubes stuck in their orifices and in incredible amounts of physical pain that even the maximum legal dose of morphine cannot adequately suppress. And yet oncologists are still the ones with the most physical understanding of how much suffering a cancer diagnosis can bring to a person. These are the people that were least likely to support PAS, while psychiatrists were the ones who were most likely. Psychiatrists, the group of people who are supposed to be finding reasons why people should live, the group of people who are trying to help people live better and more productive lives. Those are the people who are most in favor of assisted suicide. And this is another point where I feel as if the world has gone insane and that I should be putting on clown makeup. A study of Oregon, which is a wretched hive as far as I'm concerned, Emergency medicine physicians in 1996 showed that support of legalization of PASS was not influenced by gender, age, or practice location. It did show, however, that those without religious affiliations were more likely to support PASS legalization, and Catholic correspondents were least likely to support it. So yeah, again, religion plays a major factor, and religion as a factor has been decreasing significantly in the last few decades. I find it amazing to have the idea that any clinician in Oregon is particularly Christian in this day and age. Here it makes a very good point. If the practice of physician-assisted suicide is to be continually expanded to more states without understanding why physicians are generally supportive of PASS, but actually opposed to performing it, it could lead to numerous problems, including feelings of dissatisfaction with or mistrust of the profession of medicine by both physicians and patients, poor outcomes, and a lack of appropriate and effective end-of-life care. I mean, look at what happened again. 2019, in my opinion, was the year that that I'm not going to go into conspiracy theories or anything like that because there's an awful lot of nonsense about it. But during COVID, a vast number of physicians were revealed to be intensely politicized, and there is a vast amount of evidence to suggest that political affiliation, that various other factors were influencing physicians in their attitudes towards the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, just look at Anthony Fauci and the way that he acted and all these other cases. Again, it's a whole other discussion, but again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but at the same time, I completely understand why so many people became intensely distrustful of the medical profession after seeing the sheer amount of nonsense that physicians were speaking about live with the absolute sincerity that they did, and the whole stuff with the Wuhan lab and all of that. It pulled the wool off people's eyes, and they stopped. And I think an awful lot of the suspicion they now have towards these professions is fully justified on words that have come out of physicians' own mouths. But anyway, let's scroll down here because it's all just talking about the data itself, and that's all. Yeah, just the characteristics of the things. That's the legalization. Table 4 was the one that it's most interesting because this study also asked the physicians several different questions, and these were their responses. And these questions are, for example, these are the most important ones. Current laws provide adequate safeguards. Physicians who are not psychiatrists are sufficiently trained to screen for depression in patients who are seeking physician-assisted suicide. And the vast majority of physicians responded no to this. Some responded neutrally. So it's something like 150 compared to 40. Most physicians can predict with certainty whether a patient seeking PASS/AID has 6 months or less to live. The majority responded no, which I think is very, humble of physicians. I think that an awful lot of physicians do think they can predict a person's life, but I'm gratified to see that most of them agreed that this was not the case. Racial and ethnic minorities would feel pressure to end their lives. The overwhelming majority said no, which I find is very interesting. Let me look back at the chat for a second because I can see Alex is talking. Plenty of Christendom enjoying physicians in Oregon, but none of them are fair weather about it. They're committed. Okay, that's interesting. Is this about that woman/YouTuber who had offed herself and had a scheduled tweet about how awesome it was being dead and wanting to hang around with her loved ones? Yeah, in a way, it's a much broader discussion than that. Oncologists are also the most likely to see a death sentence turn into a full recovery. That's an interesting perspective, Stuffy. I don't know how to pronounce your name. I remember during 2020, the medical establishment went from full lockdown advocacy to endorsing the riots and the demonstrations vis-a-vis of George Floyd. Yeah, exactly. That was one, I think, of the greatest mask-off moments about political affiliation in psychiatry and physiology. And sorry, I'm kind of babbling, that I have ever seen in my life. PASS would save money for the healthcare system. Notice 107 agreed, 48 were neutral, and only 29 disagreed. I would be very interested on the attitudes of those 29. Health insurance companies would cover PASS over more expensive, possibly life-saving treatments like chemotherapy. Again, a decent majority said yes. And it's interesting to me that they kind of were very divided on whether or not it would lead to the legalization of euthanasia. The medical profession should endorse PASS as a morally valid medical option. 89% said yes, only 29% said were neutral, but 66% said no. 66 individuals, rather. Medical professionals should never intentionally hasten a patient's death at the end of life. This is, again, a very interesting one because, again, you can see 74 said yes, 80% said no. So this is obviously an extremely divisive question. And once more, another very divisive question. PASS would be unnecessary if all patients had access to excellent palliative care. Once again, 80 participants, not percentage, participants said no, whereas 64 said yes, which I think we can get onto in a few minutes. I pretty much just covered that, so we can skip past that. And that also goes over the number that said it should be legalized. With legalization, there would not be any penalties. That's a good definition. With legalization, there would not be any penalties attributed to the act of physician-assisted suicide. By contrast, decriminalization of physician-assisted suicide means there would be no criminal penalties for performing the act. So in other words, PASS is criminal in a large majority of places, I believe. So if a physician assists somebody in their suicide effort, then that physician can be criminally liable, whereas in some cases there is decriminalization in that, yeah, you shouldn't do it, but we're not going to charge you if you do, which is different from legalization. Legalization basically means that it's endorsed, whereas decriminalization means that it's not punished, and there is a very distinct difference. Once more, it shows only 9% of respondents indicated they would unequivocally perform PASS if it was legal. So that only 9% of respondents said they would be physically or morally comfortable with the act of assisting somebody from ending their own life. This discrepancy was something that the study participants, or the study creators, were very interested in. In order to assess why this discrepancy persists, we asked these physicians who thought PASS should be legal but would be unwilling to perform it to explain why in a free response text box. The single most common response was lack of training or expertise with respect to PASS, since it was outside the scope of their practice. It should remain outside the scope of their practice, if you ask me. And of course, there's another thing talking about spiritual teachings. And of course, it highlights here that the Hippocratic Oath says, do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath specifically refuses the idea or refutes the idea of assisted suicide. It says that if no man should provide a poison or tincture for another person to end their life with. And Isaac Hara just saying, it's scientifically proven, Fauci said so. I know. It is clear from these responses that physicians think that patients should have the option to choose physician-assisted suicide. However, doctors would be unwilling to perform it because it is outside the scope of their practice. On the one hand, this unwillingness could be due to a lack of training or expertise. Perhaps if some of these physicians had specific training in performing physician-assisted suicide, they would be more willing to perform it, which some respondents did explicitly state. And this is back on the kind of slippery slope fallacy or issue, because it worries me that the more and more that people are trained to accept physician-assisted suicide as a normal thing, the more that people will become acclimatized to it. Whereas if there remains a social stigma on the practice, then people will be more strongly motivated to find reasons not to engage in it. But the more you say to a physician, actually, we don't care if you kill someone or not, the more a physician is going to sit there and think of reasons why he should help somebody kill themselves. And I don't like that at all. I think that is a very bad preference to a very bad precedent to set. Underlying many of these outside of specialty responses is likely a feeling toward the inherent severity of PASS, which 5% of respondents explicitly identified. The feeling is explained quite well by Robert Burt when he writes about ambivalence towards death. He argues that although it is conceivable that death can be a moral good, or at least morally neutral in some cases, there exists a pervasive sense that death is wrong or a moral error. Burt writes, We cannot readily erase a persistent contrapuntal, I have never seen that word before, contrapuntal conviction that death is inherently wrong. This man is very clever. Our data seems to suggest that physicians today generally want their patients to have control over their deaths through lethal ingestion, but doctors remain uncertain about their own participation. They should. This ambivalence is further supported by the finding that those who thought PASS should be legal, 27% agree that medical professionals should never intentionally hasten death at the end of life. I completely agree. Now here we're talking about the current practice of PASS. When asked about current safeguards, most physicians agreed that they are adequate, but here we, however, come to an interesting conclusion. Physicians in general doubt that doctors who are not psychiatrists can adequately screen patients seeking PASS for depression. There is evidence to suggest that many patients with terminal cancer who seek death have depression. The data from Oregon, however, indicate that less than 5% of patients seeking PASS are evaluated by a psychiatrist. This is a damning statistic. It should be 100%. Psychological and psychiatric evaluation should be the first thing you undergo if you express a sincere and persistent desire to have somebody help end your life. It's just terrifying to me that only 5% of people were ever seen by a psychiatrist. Respondents in general disagree that most physicians can accurately predict if a patient seeking PASS has 6 months or less to live. These opinions are supported by the literature, so it is established that there is no real quantifiable way to tell how long somebody will live, and that's especially true in cases of cancer patients. It's like Stuffy illustrated earlier, that people who have been given terminal diagnoses are very often, well, not very often, but sometimes just make spontaneous recovery, spontaneous remission, even from incredibly dangerous cancer does happen. You can't simply quantify this. You can't indulge in this terrible idea that you can quantify how long a patient is going to live. You can't turn it into an economics course because you're dealing with human life. You can't just reduce it to a number. And I thought this comment was quite interesting that I will read after having my drink. It should be noted as well that prognosis is dependent on the willingness of a patient to accept treatment. A patient with insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus who refuses insulin will be dead in less than 6 months. It will be an excruciating and horrible death, by the way. Although this patient is not terminal in the classic sense, she would qualify for PASS under current law. This is a large loophole in arguably the most important safeguard of current PASS laws, and I am very grateful to this study for highlighting this issue, in that this is the definition of the slippery slope, is that when you start making these broad rulings, it becomes very easy to rules lawyer your way into saying, no, this person is admissible for this physician-assisted suicide or even euthanasia. Most physicians disagreed that patients of lower socioeconomic status, racial or ethnic minorities, and those with mental or physical disabilities would feel pressure to end their lives through PASS. This is something that I disagree with completely. The data from the aforementioned article comes from Oregon, which is a predominantly white state. Patients have historically been discriminated against based on race throughout the history of the practice of medicine, and there is no reason to assume that PASS will be any different than other practices in medicine. And this is one of the rare cases where I actually completely agree with this kind of progressive attitude, is that furthermore, those in the disability community have consistently been vocal about their fears of abuse with respect to PASS. These communities are concerned that medical professionals may deem the lives of those living with disabilities as not worth living. These concerns must be heard and routinely evaluated to ensure safe practices of PASS. And this is so annoying to me that the whole racism movement, the whole ableist movement or whatever, has been so completely hijacked by insane people who rant on about ludicrous and demented things that have no basis in reality. Because this right here is one of the very rare cases where this kind of logic and this kind of methodology has a completely legitimate application, because I agree with this study completely, that when you are of a discriminated minority, when you are of a lower socioeconomic status, then it is completely valid to conduct research to see how those effects can result in a negative outcome. This is one case where all of the people who are researching diversity, that are researching, DEI, all of that nonsense, where there's, well, I don't think they actually have skills, but those who have legitimate credentials and have legitimate practices, they could turn their attention to stuff like this and produce legitimate, useful data. But they don't. They just don't. So, another kind of insane thing that you have to think about when dealing with this. With respect to economic ramifications of legalization of PASS, most physicians thought it would save the healthcare system money. This is consistent with findings from a recent article published in Canada that suggested the Canadian healthcare system could save as much as $140 million through the use of PASS. The US desperately needs to control its healthcare spending. In 2010, 1/4 of all Medicare spending was attributed to the last year of life. It is apparent that any practice that effectively shortens the length of end-of-life care will likely decrease the cost of healthcare nationwide. And I think that the study authors are fairly anti-PASS in general because of statements like this. I think this is it. But as we have argued elsewhere, it is far easier for physicians to help patients jump to their deaths through PASS than it is to sit with them, listen, and coordinate the help of ancillary staff like social workers and chaplains to address patients' concerns, existential, spiritual, familial, and personal concerns at the end of life. Proctor is woke. It's so over, TVA bros. Yep, this is definitely my awakening moment. With respect to the slippery slope argument, a slight majority disagreed that the legalization of PASS would lead to the legalization of euthanasia, while about a third agreed. There was a motion recently brought up in the Oregon Senate to allow individuals identified by a power of attorney to administer the lethal drugs to the terminally ill patient if that patient no longer had the capacity to administer it themselves. Furthermore, on January the 15th, 2019, a bill was introduced in the New Mexico House entitled Elizabeth Whitefield End-of-Life Option Act. This would make PASS legal in New Mexico and expand the inclusion criteria. The bill does not require a patient to self-administer and allows patients with mental illnesses to request PASS. This is certainly evidence that the slippery slope argument does have merit in the US and must be considered. Let me just see how much further there is at this. Just a little bit more. Furthermore, of those who thought PASS should be legal, 81% agreed that PASS should be endorsed by the medical profession as a morally valid option. Only 19% disagreed or were unsure. And I think that number is a very scary number because, again, I mean, we've already discussed that, so I'm not going to go too much further into it. And here it says, again, it goes back to the whole inadequate data thing. The lack of training response. Due to the qualitative nature of the question, it should be addressed by focus groups or other qualitative methods. It already should have. It already should have. Such a study would be invaluable in uncovering more information about why this discrepancy between belief and practice. The fact that these studies are only just now being done is horrifying. We found that 38% of physicians agreed that PASS would be unnecessary if excellent palliative care were available to all patients at the end of life, and 45% of physicians disagreed. I actually do think that there is grounds for this argument because, again, when you have excellent palliative care for something like extreme cancer, then it doesn't really matter. You're going to suffer incredibly badly towards the end of your life, even if you have the best care possible. So, I do think that there are some cases where assisted suicide is a valid choice because there is an objective level on which your life is completely unbearable. But going down here to the conclusion. So it points out this discrepancy again. But this, I thought, I'm not going to read all of this because we've already discussed most of it. This shows to me that physicians are simply unaware of the seriousness and of the depth of this whole situation. I think that physicians should be trained to address this kind of thing, that the moral and ethical ramifications of physician-assisted suicide should be talked about in much greater detail and in an objective fashion, because it feels as if the lack of uniformity of opinion on this subject is just being exploited by bad actors to push through these legislations. Simply because people have not really thought about it before, they're caught off guard. They don't have good arguments, and they tend to disagree on how things are. And that's what worries me the most, is that this is something, and I think that the decline of religion, the decline of external morality, of external sources of morality on which to base strong arguments for the value of life on, is a major reason why we have these problems. That people just kind of are in a mental state where they go, assisted dying, well, maybe it's a bad thing, but I can't really think of why, so maybe I'm wrong, and I'm not qualified to talk about it, so I don't want to think about it. I think that's a terrible attitude to have, and I think that people should have much, much different attitudes towards it. So I've got a bunch of pings on Discord, which I will look at for a second. I just need to take a very quick break for just 2 seconds to go to the bathroom, so I will be right back in a moment. It's a logical point since we're at the end of this study. My voice is starting to crack a little bit too, so we're going to move on, I think, to a documentary that I watched where I want to play some decent clips of it, because I think it humanizes the problem a great deal. So I will be back in a moment. BRB. Hello, chat. I am back. Sorry about that break. At least play Rama Rama on your break. I mean, it's like, I actually do have a BRB screen in production, so we'll see how that goes. I'm seriously thinking of going to Twitch for a little bit, simply because I would like to be able to play more music in the background and so on, but the moment I try to do that, YouTube copyright just starts screaming at me and throwing a fit. Let me just look through all of my tabs and make sure I've got the right thing. Because this next part that we're going to watch is basically clips from this documentary that I was watching. Let me just make sure I've got my desktop sound on as well. There we go. and it's in one of the sources. It's called Fatal Flaws, the Assisted Death Debate Euthanasia Documentary. Let me just, because I have a bunch of timestamps copied down. And it really goes back to the heart of this whole thing, where... no, that's not what... that's not the one I wanted. Is this freaking broken? I swear it is. Why is it doing that? This is so annoying. Technical issues, please stand by! Where on earth can I find this? Ah, there we are. That works. That works. So it's my first time trying to do YouTube timestamps like this, so when I'm pasting it into the URL. Right then, okay, let me just tab back in and we can look at this. Imagine thinking of going to Twitch. Where's the red-headed boy? That's not actually my avatar. Gonna have to AI a big titty PNG model for Proctor if he starts doing Twitch. No, thank you, please no. But here we are. Here's this wonderful documentary. I'm not going to play all of it, obviously, because it's over an hour long, but there was several parts of it that I thought were absolutely fascinating. And this particular one is with one of the original doctors whose actions were resulted in the legalization of assisted suicide in the Netherlands. And I thought his perspective on all of this was rather fascinating, so I'll give my throat a chance to rest, and we'll just play this part of it, because I think it's not too long. It's not too long, it's only a couple of minutes. I shall have some cherries in syrup, because I really like cherries. Not for reasons related to a certain white fox, but I actually really like cherries in general, so I'm going to have some of these Amarena sour cherries in syrup, because syrup for my throat sounds very good for now, so let's begin.
And in the Netherlands, they've been talking about euthanasia for nearly 50 years. In 1973, a doctor ended her elderly mother's life. She could have been charged with murder under the law, but she was given no jail time. In the 1990s, Dutch lawmakers got in on the discussion.
We had one member of High Court who said, well, whenever someone reaches a certain age, they should have a last will pill available to take their own life.
Can you imagine that kind of idea? A last will pill that after you, let's say you hit 70, the government literally sends you cyanide pills in the mail and calls them your last will pill that you can just take to kill yourself painlessly whenever you want. Wouldn't that be wonderful, chat? Wouldn't it be lovely if the government just mailed you a set of pills to take whenever you wanted if you decided that your life wasn't worth living any longer? And you could have those on your mantelpiece so that every single time you go to bed, you can just be lying there and thinking about how you had an argument with your spouse, or there's a bill coming in that you don't want to pay. Then you see that packet on the mantelpiece and go, hey, I've got an easy out. I just take these and close my eyes. It'll never be a problem again. You think you hate politicians enough, but you really don't.
That was here in The Hague when Supreme Court Justice Hugh Drion first introduced the idea of a doctor-assisted suicide for people over the age of 70.
In 1991, Dr. Bedouin Shabbat made history by giving a lethal dose of medicine to a patient who wasn't suffering any terminal medical condition.
Many know you as the pioneer, if you will, of euthanasia here in the Netherlands. Does that title strike you strange?
I've got used to that, and in fact, in 1991, this was an exceptional thing to do, as there was no law in sight. 10 years before the law, this woman came to me asking for a physician aid in dying. I dislike the word euthanasia. I prefer the PAD thing. And she...
No, words, the definition of words has meaning. There's a joke in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy which talks about this. I'm not going to recite it too long, but The joke is that to try and kill somebody, they respell the definition of the word murder, so they're legally allowed to kill her. And then they call it ceasing to be, a contractual agreement to cease to be, so that it's not murder. You're just contractually obligated to cease to be.
Well, she was a 50-year-old, healthy social worker with many friends, but she had lost her 2 kids under dramatic circumstances. The one by young cancer disease and the other shot himself after his first love dropped him. And so after that she didn't want to live anymore. In terms of today, we would call this purely existential suffering.
Dr. Chabot consulted 4 psychiatrists who were split on what to do. 2 said she should be given therapy. The other 2 said there was no cure for a parent's grief.
Now, this is another thing that should terrify you if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. So this guy, who is a medical doctor and not a psychiatrist, is reached out to by a patient who wants him to kill her. Now, he goes to 4 different psychiatrists for a second opinion. Notice how he never once says that he referred this woman to any of these psychiatrists. There is no evidence from this interview that this doctor made any effort to actually get his patient to seek psychiatric help. The only time he involves psychiatrists in any of this decision-making process is when he himself is trying to search for outside justification to kill this woman.
I came to her house. We had, with a friend, a GP, a personal friend, and she was together with her best friend, a woman, and I handed her the drink, saying, I hope you'll flush this through the toilet now, because you don't have to proceed because I'm now here. She said, oh no. And she went on her bed, we were sitting next to it, and she was very happy to drink it, and then she died within half an hour in the arms of her best friend.
And what was the verdict in the end?
Guilty without punishment, which is very special for your country, I guess, because if you're guilty, you should be punished.
In my eyes, this guy is guilty of murder. And I actually would not consider him guilty of murder if he had done what I suggested before. If he had taken this woman's case upon himself and he had exhausted all psychiatric avenues available to her, he had made sure that she had gotten as much psychiatric help as possible. Sorry for sniffling. And he'd still decided to go through with it after they had completely exhausted all avenues of treatment, and she still wanted to die. I would say he would still be committing a crime, but it would not be murder. But in this case, it's just maybe again, this is a documentary that is against the idea of assisted dying or euthanasia. So if they have been manipulatively editing this guy to take out the context of his years-long struggle to help this woman find reasons to live, then okay, I'm perfectly willing to accept that possibility, because, you know, it's not as if documentary makers ever lie or manipulatively edit any of their interviews. Further away than the biggest euthanasia specialist in the country? Yeah, Restless Rain, I agree. Like, Biohazard Exa, to be the devil's advocate here, sometimes these specialists are quite far away. He could have sent patient files. I mean, again, that's an argument, but in the absence of any evidence to potentially support that argument, I think that you can safely dismiss it. I think that what this person... But it frames... It ties back to what I was saying about an hour or so ago, when... You create a society where the idea of helping somebody else to die is normalized, even in terms of the philosophical discussion surrounding it, rather than the legal actions related to it, then you can get circumstances like this where a person can be of the mindset that they are doing the right thing and they are helping somebody to achieve an end that they desire. And because of the way they have been programmed to think about it, they do not contemplate all the other things they could do instead, which might have a different outcome. I mean, can you imagine this guy talking to 4 separate psychologists, and instead of saying to them, "Hey, I've got this woman who wants to kill herself. Can I work with you as a go-between? You know, can I send her your information, your address, etc.?" He instead goes to them and says, "Hey, I've got a patient who wants to kill herself. Can you help me to morally justify killing her?" Again, it's just it's a clown world moment. It's a pure clown world moment. And let me look at my timestamps again. And again, here we have a little bit further on, T375. I believe that by pasting this in, it will take me straight there. Paste. Please work.
Have you had people come to ask you for euthanasia?
Yes.
Have you performed euthanasia?
Yes.
Robert Jonquière is a retired Dutch family doctor who is now executive director of the World Federation of Right to Die Societies.
The fact that there is a World Federation of Right to Die Societies is another reason why you should start putting on the damn clown makeup at this point.
He admits that the reason people are choosing to die is changing.
When we started in the Netherlands, our law, our euthanasia practice and our law, 85 to 90% of the cases were terminal physical situations. We have developed the last 15 years a situation where it became more and more clear that it was not about termination of terminal illness, but it was termination of suffering. And you can suffer of many things. You can also suffer from psychiatric situations, from existential situations, from dementia or whatever. I mean,
but doesn't that scare you? Doesn't it like to me it scares me. It scares me to think that it's going to keep on moving and moving and moving.
I don't believe it. I mean, that's the big difference and the big discussions we have around the world.
Yeah, notice how he says, "I don't think I haven't actually watched the complete documentary yet. There's still like 20 minutes at the end I haven't watched because I was so distracted by all the PubMed studies." The way he just says, "I don't believe it," when confronted with this evidence after he's already stated himself that the problem here is that he's admitted it. He's admitted right there that the reasons why people are seeking right to die is changing. It's changing from fatal end-of-life conditions to, less fatal, less end-of-life things. And he's pointed out the slippery slope fallacy, and his entire response is, "I don't believe it."
I mean, the slippery slope argument, once you start legalizing the situation, the option to euthanize a patient when he asks in a terminal situation, next you will see that doctors will go around killing patients when they have dementia, things like that.
Does that happen?
I don't think it is the simple way I describe it. That's not what's happening.
Now, let me just play this another for a second because he might just go straight into this outfit.
The slippery slope Dr. Jonquière is talking about might not scare him, but the way the regulations keep expanding terrifies me. And I'm not alone. Critics say these laws open the door to abuse of elderly patients when they are at their most vulnerable.
Yeah, this example is a few minutes long, but it's very worth talking about because it's the perfect example of where all of this goes wrong. I'll just turn subs on as well.
My mom, if she had been left in hospital without me visiting her and fighting for her, she wouldn't be here.
When somebody wanted to give up on you, you didn't give up.
My mom is 94 years old. She had a slip and a fall, and she was taken into hospital. And the only thing that appeared wrong with her was that she had an infection. Within the first day, she responded very well to the antibiotics. She started to improve. But she had increased her pain enormously. And there was nothing to do about it except to administer morphine. And so they said, well, we suspect maybe she's got something wrong, a blockage or something. The discussion at the time was, well, yeah, we have a lot of things we have to do and we don't know if it's worth it. Because of this supposedly blockage, they stopped to feed her and they stopped administering water. And to me, it was looking like they were stopping and not looking and not going further to find out what is wrong with her. And unfortunately, my mom at that moment said, I don't want to live anymore. I cannot eat, I don't get water, I have pain, you're moving me around, I cannot live like this anymore. The nurse took this through to the doctor as a request for end of life. And there was a meeting with my mom to which I was not invited. And my mom told me that they had discussed end of life.
I feel like interjecting here because this is a problem that exists in the health system to a great degree. In that, and it's a bizarre situation that, and it's another twisting of medical ethics, and I've seen it happen to quite a few people. By then, Magdalena's Rex, I hope you enjoy, Leah. I genuinely hope that her stream is happier and nicer than mine. I do understand how miserable this is for an awful lot of people, but again, I feel a great sense of catharsis to be able to talk to my community about this kind of stuff. But one example that I know personally is a friend of the family whose mother has fairly advanced dementia. And she also has several fairly serious medical conditions. But she has dementia in a way where her long-term and short-term memories are very bad, but her presentation is still fairly put together. She can still hold conversations with people, she can still move around and so forth. And the problem, this is in England, by the way, this is in the UK, and that every time she goes to the doctor, because she has not given power of attorney to her son, who is her primary caregiver, the doctor refuses to share any medical communications that he makes between himself and this man's mother with the son. And so what will happen is the son has to drive her to the hospital, and then the doctor sees the mother, and they have a conversation about serious medical issues, and the mother forgets about it almost immediately. And when she emerges from the room, which her son has to sit outside of, and her son asks her, "Hey, what did the doctor say?" She just turns to him and says, "What do you mean? I haven't seen a doctor at all. What are you talking about? Why are we in the hospital?" But that has been the status quo between them for years. And it was the same when my mother went into hospital to have a major operation a few years ago. She was put in a recovery ward with another woman who had dementia, and she actually almost saved this woman's life because this woman had advanced dementia, and the nurses would bring her food, and she wouldn't eat anything. She would not eat and she wouldn't drink. But she would fuss around with the plate, so she would make it look as if she had interacted with the plate and that she looked as if she had eaten. And so the nurse would later come along and they would take the food away and dispose of it, leaving this woman with no food. And my mother watched that woman for almost 2 days. She was given 6 meals. She didn't eat anything. And the nurses, because there was a chart on the bed itself, every time that she didn't eat, the nurses would still mark down that she had been given food. But giving food is different from the patient having eaten. And this woman was then assessed by a doctor who was just sitting beside her and saying, talking to her. And it was clear the woman didn't understand anything because she was that badly demented. And in the end, the doctor said, well, it's good that your chart says that you've been eating and drinking at least. And that's when my mother spoke up and said, no, I've been watching this woman for nearly 48 hours and she has not eaten and drunken anything. And the doctor said, that is tremendously good news. Thank you so much for telling me. And then she called the nurses to take the woman away and put her on an intravenous nutrition because she wasn't capable of eating any longer. But that would not have happened. I mean, my mother said I could see this doctor was getting up and was starting to leave because she was just going by the chart on the patient's bed, which said clearly, this woman has received food and water for the last 48 hours. And this kind of ambiguity, especially when it's distributed between multiple different people, it creates a terrible I was just following orders scenario where multiple people are doing basically the wrong things, but their decisions are made in a vacuum. And when they're confronted with their decisions, they can just say, maybe even with what they feel is complete moral certainty, but I was just in charge of doing this bit, or I was just in charge of doing that bit. What happened elsewhere isn't my business. I just did what I was told. I can say in front of a panel of judges, I acted in good faith, so it's not my problem. And that is what disturbs me about examples like this. Let me continue playing. Sorry, I was waving around a fork just then. That's what just tapped onto their table.
And they said that only 48 hours and no euthanasia.
So what about a second opinion?
So I called for a second opinion, I called for geriatric doctor, and so we redid the discussion over the end-of-life story with my mom. Yes, through that second opinion, by bringing in that second doctor, we managed to stop that movement of the original doctor to accept and say, it's over. She said, this lady has got a reason to live. Immediately, he said, he promised me he would check whether there was a blockage first. There was no blockage. She was allowed anything to drink and eat that she wanted. She just improved after that. Really now she's in a nursing home, and since she's been there, she's just one of the most popular old ladies in that home. You might say, there's an old lady, she's 94, she's lived a good life. Which is what they said to me. Why are you bothering? I said,
this is genuinely what hurts me to my core. This is, unironically makes me want to cry. It's this attitude. Can you imagine a doctor just coming in and saying, why are you bothering with this person? They're going to die anyway. Like, if you have reached that point as a physician, I think that you should stop becoming a physician. Like, regardless of how important physicians are, regardless of the doctor shortage, if a doctor can look you in the eye and say something like, why do you care about this patient? They are going to die anyway. That doctor has reached a stage where they either need to leave the profession or they urgently need some form of extra training. It's a horrifying thing to say. It's a horrifying thing to even think about. It's one of the worst things that I think that you can possibly do as a physician. Is there much more of this? No, I don't think so.
it's my mom. Don't take her away.
Now,
Yep. That's pretty much pretty good. That's but it gets worse, guys. It gets worse because this is the next timestamp. 1 second. Let me just check my interview with. Yeah, that was the interview thing. Sorry, guys. I'm just looking through my stuff there. Yep, we're good. Here we go.
Oversight is a big concern in the Netherlands. In 2016, the media reported that a doctor was charged after euthanizing a patient who had to be physically restrained by the family. The patient had said they wanted to be euthanized in case of dementia, but physically fought back when the doctor was giving the lethal injection. This is something that euthanasia advocates are even upset about.
My
They should
simple
be.
answer is that is a crime. That is just a criminal act by a medical professional. Because she said, I don't want it, and he still did it. that's murder. Simple as that. Just 10 seconds before I put the injection in, I say, look in the eyes, and I say, is this what you really want?
Now, this is another thing, is that this guy is the World Federation, is the executive director of the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. And yet he has performed euthanasia on multiple people. And I think that that act itself should bar him from any kind of political position in this kind of society. I mean, I can understand that it's just a conflict of interests. I think that if you do have a World Federation of Right to Die societies, because again, I'm against censorship in pretty much all of its forms, so I think that the legality of such a federation is perfectly okay. But the idea that it is not patient-led, that it is instead in the power of doctors who are the ones euthanizing people. You can be a consultant for something like a World Federation of Right to Die societies. You can be a professional, somebody who gives professional opinions on the topics they discuss. But the idea that this guy is an executive director and kills people, again, that's another thing that I think is just absolutely morally wrong, and it creates a conflict of interests that should not be tolerated.
And if you say, I'm hesitating, I stop immediately. And maybe after 5 minutes you say, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing which is happening. And if the patient has written down whatever, if you orally say no, then no is the answer.
Dr. Jacquier says it's murder, but a legal review found the euthanasia was performed in good faith.
Once again, it's clown world. It's just clown world. That if acting in good faith, I have no comments here aside from that I am shocked and horrified by the whole thing. Let me see. Yes, and there's another bit, but I think that we don't need to go into that just this second, because there was another point that I wanted to bring up with people, which is very important. And when you're talking about the slippery slope, you have to, we've already covered socio-economic factors in passing, but there are much bigger concerns about it. And one of them was informed to me by our wonderful Discord members, and I really appreciate it. And where is it exactly? Yes, the burden of disease. This is from Our World in Data. And it talks about the burden of disease, obviously. Premature death and ill health, the global burden of disease. The human potential that is lost due to poor health is immense. 55.9 million people died in 2017. If we sum up all the life years lost due to premature death, we find that the world population lost 1.65 billion years of potential life due to premature death in that year. And this is Dali's. This is Dali's. Salvador Dali. We measure this in Salvador Dali's. But the issue is that they are talking not only that when they talk about disease burden, they're not just talking about the burden to individuals, but instead they are talking about a combination of the loss of productivity and value of life that is inflicted upon society by the existence of people who are terminally ill. It does not actually talk about or include the idea that these people who are terminally ill themselves have a value of life that they're not getting. I mean, it does in some ways, but the implication is pretty clear in all of this. And basically, when you use a system like this, you're saying on a quantitative data-based level that if a terminally ill person chooses to end their own life, rather than live out the rest of their life as much as possible. This includes things like mental disorders, disabilities in general too. If somebody with any kind of disability chooses to end their life, then while it may be that they themselves are losing a portion of their life, they are also improving the average quality of life for other people, because now those other people are not required to care for those disabled or otherwise or terminally ill people. So when people start killing themselves based on those criteria, the burden of disease actually goes down because those people no longer need to be cared for. One moment here. It's also one of the thing that I was looking at. I need to find it. Please, I apologize for this. Give me just 1 second. I have too many tabs open, which is very irritating to me. Oh yeah, this was another terrifying thing too. This is from The Guardian, Britain's wonderful liberal rag, where it says, "Law banning assisted dying is dangerous and cruel, says senior doctors." So, that was another wonderful thing that I had to look through. Where is it now? No, that's the same article open twice. Why am I like this? Oh yeah, here's what I wanted to talk as well, because this refers to Canada's system as well, an evidence-based approach to assisted dying. Research by Professor Penny Lewis has contributed directly to legal changes in Australia and Canada, significantly influencing debates in Ireland, aka where I live, and in England and Wales. Down here it says, assisted dying remains illegal in England and Wales, but the 2010 policy on assisted suicide advises against prosecution if the victim had reached a voluntary, clear, settled, and informed decision to commit suicide, and any person assisting was wholly motivated by compassion. So that ties back to something that we were discussing earlier as well, where a number of physicians, where there was the difference between the idea of endorsing physician assistance in dying, and also the idea of simply decriminalizing it. But this was the really scary part, talking about the slippery slope. Opponents of assisted dying have argued that legalization is a slippery slope, often pointing to the example of the Netherlands, which we just talked about. In the Netherlands, euthanasia has been lawful since the 1970s. Doctors have used a statutory defense of necessity to avoid prosecution in cases where they have provided MAiD, justifying their involvement as a necessary step to prevent suffering. In the early cases in which the necessity defense was used, the patient had requested MAiD. The same defense was then used to permit MAiD in cases where the patient was unable to communicate. We just talked about that in that documentary. Look, the person who had agreed to dying in advance and then refused it when it was the time. Burden of disease sounds like something a warlock would curse you with. One of Lewis's most important conclusions was that the use of the defense of necessity in the second set of cases was not evidence of a slippery slope. Instead, she argued, the two sets of cases were underpinned by the same principle, that Dutch doctors have a duty to relieve suffering. The acceptability of this defense in cases involving an incompetent patient was explained by the Dutch system's focus on doctors' duties rather than patients' rights. Based on the data from Belgium and the Netherlands, Lewis research also concluded that there was no evidence that legislation had led to either non-voluntary euthanasia or increases in the overall rate of assisted dying. And this is another issue that I found, is that there are a lot of studies out there which come to the conclusion that no, these aren't an issue. Nobody is getting killed against their will. That's a nonsense. That's a conspiracy theory. How dare you say such insane lies? Now, guys, I would like to remind you of something that caused a massive stir in America actually, it was a bit more than a few years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago by now, where it was ruled that the police have no duty of care to the public, where a police officer's actions in in the court of law are not determined by how beneficial those actions were to the public that he is supposed to be serving, but are instead based on other factors. In other words, a policeman can do something that is harmful to the public, but they can then be cleared of all responsibility because that harm to the public factor is not included. And the exact same issue is being used in this case, where they're saying that the doctor has a desire to relieve suffering. And by killing somebody, they are relieving that suffering on a greater basis than they are if they give that person palliative care at the end of their life, which is a fucking terrifying precedent. And this is a woman arguing this too, which is astonishing to me. So they are saying that if a physician decides arbitrarily, without the patient's informed consent, that they are better off dead than alive, that doctor can then act to kill the patient. I don't know what Rex is on about. This is a pretty good Elden Ring background podcast. I'm glad that somebody is gaming while listening to this. And it says here, in Canada, this argument was influential in the landmark decision by the Supreme Court, which led to the decriminalization of assisted suicide in Canada in June 2016. Lewis acted as an expert witness for the claimants Kay Carter and Gloria Taylor, both of whom suffering from degenerative diseases. The Canadian government argued that decriminalization would make it impossible to protect vulnerable people and that the country would descend into condoning murder. This is a very rare Canadian W. The Canadian government itself argued that decriminalization would make it impossible to protect vulnerable people. This was in 2016. And guess what we're going to look at in a few seconds? Since decriminalization, over 13,000 Canadians have received MAiD, and medical practitioners can prescribe or administer drugs without fear of prosecution. The Canadian experience has informed the debate in a number of other countries. The trial judge, after an exhaustive review of the evidence, which included Lewis's affidavit, rejected the argument that adoption of a regulatory regime would initiate a descent down a slippery slope into homicide. The Supreme Court of Canada concluded there was no error in this trial judge's analysis. If Canada sunk into the sea tomorrow, the only tears that I would shed would be for the few based VTubers that would be affected by the death of Sakana. Where is it? Did I ever? No, I didn't actually. Actually, I'll just transfer this over because this was an article that I didn't actually change over to this, so I'll be a second. I'm probably going to go for another 20 minutes or so after we've covered this article that we're about to look at from the National Post. There is a ton more that I could talk about, but I'm going to see what happens on Wednesday. If nothing in the VTuber space has completely exploded by Wednesday, I'm going to do a follow-up stream on all of this, because this is barely even a quarter of the stuff that I've looked at. And I want to... I feel a duty of care. I feel a bigger duty of care than the fucking Canadian government towards people who are discussing this topic to present the case decently. Right, here we go. Chris Shelley, How to Not Euthanize the Homeless. Canada's euthanasia debate is unhinged, but sanity is still within our grasp. I politely disagree. A recent poll suggests nearly 30% of Canadians believe homelessness should be adequate grounds to seek medical assistance in dying. It's a surprisingly high number in my colleague Colby Kosh's estimation, and my sense is most Canadians agree. On social media, folks alarmed by Canada's current trajectory on euthanasia have wrapped it into some sort of rapidly unfolding dystopian narrative, understandably, considering how quickly and needlessly Canada has lost the plot on euthanasia. The poll landed more or less concurrently with an extended essay in the Journal of Medical Ethics by University of Toronto philosophy professors who argue we mustn't deny MAiD to those seeking it on account of unjust social... I'll just zoom in a bit, by the way. Unjust social circumstances. Philosophy professors. You know that thing that Pol Pot did where he killed all of the intellectuals? I wish to just say that was a terrible and dreadful and evil and disgusting thing of him to do. But when you read stuff like this, you can kind of understand why he decided that such radical actions were necessary. I'm down to hear more of this. That's a modest proposal-esque title for an article. That's something we've heard much about in recent months. The man applying for MAiD in terror of finding himself homeless. The woman unable to find housing suitable for her multiple chemical sensitivities. The fact that better supports are not provided in cases like these is abhorrent, and the lack of options constitutes a deep injustice. But restricting an autonomous choice to pursue MAiD due to the injustice of current non-ideal circumstances causes more harm than allowing the choice to pursue MAiD, even though that choice is deeply tragic. These people are insane. These people are actually demented. These people do not deserve even a single second of your time and attention. If you meet somebody like this who starts expressing these kinds of opinions, you should run away very fast. It has always seemed to me that the most permissive visions of euthanasia being promoted in Canada run counter to the harm reduction principle that many of the same people promote with respect to drug addiction. A very good point. Some Canadian jurisdictions offer addicts supervised injection sites and thus a near zero chance of overdosing fatally. Some offer addicts a safer supply of drugs on the same principle. They can't get better if they don't stay alive. I love this quote. You bloody well shouldn't get a fatal dose of barbiturates for depression. Weib and Mullin actually argue for MAiD in situations of social injustice as a harm reduction approach. It boggles my mind. Yeah, it boggles mine too. I'm convinced almost everyone is making this far more complicated than it needs to be. 73% of Canadians support allowing MAiD for those with a grievous and irredeemable medical condition, Canada's original law more or less, before it was swiftly broadened. Again, swiftly broadened, slippery slope. Only 16% oppose that, the poll suggests. Solid majorities in every region, age group, and political affiliation are on board with helping people who are already suffering at death's door step across the threshold on their own terms. Again, even I'm in agreement with this. Then there's everything else. There are serious medical conditions, physical and psychological, that won't kill the patient in the short term, if ever. There are conditions like electromagnetic hypersensitivity and multiple chemical sensitivity, which undeniably cause suffering even though they can't scientifically be proven to exist. There are social conditions that cause that, etc. Certainly with respect to the latter, I'm astonished anyone in the medical community wants anything to do with prescribing MAiD. It's not to diminish the suffering that comes with the aforementioned afflictions, simply to say that they aren't terminal medical conditions or medical conditions at all, and thus shouldn't be treated with medical assistance in dying. So what if we created two separate regimes, medical assistance in dying and just assistance in dying? The idea first came to me as a very black comedy, but more and more I think that it's at least a useful thought experiment. If you have a painful and untreatable terminal illness, we'll offer you medical assistance in dying. In other cases, rules and regulations to be determined, we might send you home with a cocktail of lethal drugs, or require you to take them in front of a death registrar or other government official. He is literally talking about fucking suicide booths. And I'm going to cut down on the swearing because I try not to, but this is really... That's what medical assistance in dying means, other than in Canada. Everyone else calls what we do euthanasia. They should, they're correct. But for some reason we didn't have the stomach for the E word. Oregon and Washington's MAiD regimes, for example, require patients to self-administer a fatal drug cocktail prescribed by a doctor under strictly controlled circumstances, which do not include homelessness. But there's no reason Ottawa can't allow social workers or shelter managers to hand them as they see fit. Why not just install gas pumps in the homeless shelters and just turn them on? This would trigger the same complaints we hear about every proposal to limit MAiD, that it infringes upon the rights of charter-protected groups. But as I've argued before, medicine is almost never about rights. It's about diagnosing illnesses and treating them appropriately. You can't get a kidney transplant for depression or a fentanyl prescription for an overgrown toe, and you bloody well shouldn't get a fatal dose of barbiturates for depression. At least my modest proposal, he literally calls it a modest proposal, would save the medical profession the indignity of euthanizing the homeless. At least it would make some kind of grim practical sense. But the real solution, of course, is for Ottawa to nut up and draw the line where most Canadians want it drawn. Terminal, untreatable, painful. The research polls suggest 20% of us think MAiD should be available to anyone for any reason. If that's surprisingly high, it's still a hell of a lot less than 80%. There is a wisdom in the crowds. And that's the end of the article. And I feel like... But I feel like there is... I'm going to more or less end things... It is ballsy, I quite agree. I'm going to end things here because there's one other thing that I would like... There's one other video that I would like to bring up. And I'm afraid that it is a Jordan Peterson video. Let me just mute myself for a second while I get this up properly and mess around to find the right timestamp. Because I know a lot of people don't like Jordan Peterson. I do think he is a massive pseudo-intellectual in a lot of ways, but I did find his commentary here to be very insightful and very effective, and also the historical context of it. Just one second. Give me a second, please. He speaks so slowly, it's annoying. Here it is. 1 second, please. 5:40, all right? Because again, he says he's good at saying the quiet part out loud. I will admit to him on that. Right, 5:40. I didn't copy the timestamp because I'm an idiot. Actually, about 38. Right. He says, look it up for yourself. Here we go. Proctor makes a stream about suicide, says he's going to end it. We had a good run, lads.
Before the Nazis started their extermination program, before they started the Holocaust, they started it with a public health campaign, right? And the Nazis came to power partly promising to clean up the country on the disease side. And they did. They produced universal treatments for tuberculosis. They upped the standards of hygiene in German hospitals.
Sorry, 1 second. I think my stream has slightly bugged for a second. Give me a moment. Let me just look at my live broadcast, live review. Yeah, for some reason it stopped showing this. 1 moment. Let me try and get this right. And go back to just chatting and try and fix this. For some reason, YouTube Capture has just stopped working. Give me just 1 second. It's scuffed! Oh no! Here we are. Wait, no, that's not the one. Why doesn't... Oh, here it is. Oh, I've got it open on the wrong thing. My apologies. I'm very stupid. That's what was wrong. My apologies. Come on, do this properly. Why is it doing that? What is going on with my stupid thing? For a second. What? I'm sorry, guys. This is annoying and bugging out, but it's the last thing I want to play, and it's just him talking. So I'll just continue. My second. My apologies about that.
Then they went to the factories and started cleaning them up. And they used Zyklon B. If I remember, there's 2 variants of Zyklon, which is a toxic gas. And they used them in factories to get rid of the insects and the rats. And they had the factory owners clean up the factories and plant flowers and, just sort of beautify the place. And Zyklon B was a pretty effective means of eliminating parasites. Insects.
A little bit too good at that.
Then they went into the mental hospitals. And there is not much more that's more brutal than a backward in a mental hospital before psychiatric drugs. I worked at the Douglas Hospital in Montreal, after deinstitutionalization, but before some of the long-term backwards patients had passed away. And I remember taking my younger brother down into the tunnels that connected the hospital buildings on the Douglas Hospital campus, which was kind of like a university. And it was like Dante's Inferno down there, man. You can't imagine how damaged those people were. 30 years on a back ward in a locked psychiatric clinic. Jesus, imagine being manic or schizophrenic under those conditions, locked in a straitjacket maybe for 20 years, maybe in agony. You just can't imagine what that would be like for decades. And the Nazis basically said that. They said, Jesus, you know, if you guys went into those back wards, you'd think death is preferable. And plus, you know, it's not like it's cheap to keep those people alive in their desperate suffering, and we could spend that money on the typical thing that, you know, implicitly psychopathic murderers pretend to spend money on, like education. And so, away the Germans went and cleaned up the asylums, and then, well, then the disabled were sort of next on the list, because turned out they were kind of expensive too and inconvenient. And you're going to be expensive and inconvenient at some point. You're probably that already. And you know, you'll probably be expensive, inconvenient, and desperate at some point too. Highly probable. Most people have, many people have at least one episode of severe depression in their life. You know, and severe depression will make you suicidal. That's one of its cardinal symptoms. And one of the accompanying thoughts that characterizes severe depression is, everyone would be better off without me. And, you know, you can think about that as self-pitying, but, and sometimes it is, you know, that's usually accompanied by kind of delusional notions about how sad and hurt everyone will be at the funeral and how sorry they'll be for picking on you. And that's not depression. That's narcissistic neuroticism. Depression is accompanied by the genuine belief that you're pretty damn useless and everyone around you would be better off without you. And I'm sure many of you have thought that at some point in your life already. And are you so sure that you wouldn't have called up the friendly Trudeau government and had them give you a hand just at that point? I think it's 30,000 people we've already managed to dispense with in this country. As I said already, you know, Canada's international reputation is in tatters. And
that's more or less where the clip that I wanted to share ends, but I find it amusing because this on his channel was posted 7 months ago. And hear that figure. He said that about, what, 30,000 or so? And that was 7 months ago. So in this article, the other article that we read, which is posted sooner, said that it's now over 100,000. So yeah, in less than 7 months, Canada has managed to kill about an extra 60, 70,000 people. Congratulations, Canada. Congratulations, Canada. You never cease to amaze me. But anyway, we have been live for 2 hours and 33 minutes by now. I'm surprised so many people have actually bothered tuning in to look at this. I think our peak was nearly 60, which was very pleasant. But I am more or less out. The next thing that I would like to read is another big, long study, which I don't want to do right at this moment, so with my throat the way it is. So I am going to stop the stream here. But as I said earlier, I am probably going to go live on this topic again around Wednesday, because we're fortunate that the VTuber community seems to have somewhat stabilized to at least a certain degree, so that I'm not too worried about somebody massively graduating in the next few days. I mean, if it does, I'll change the stream topic, because goodness knows you have to be willing to multitask in this profession of mine that I've taken. But I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed that stream, because frankly that stream was extremely depressing, and I think I'm going to go and have a nice strong cup of coffee and maybe something sweet and sticky to eat to take my mind off it. But it does gratify me immensely to see that there are some people that are at least interested in sticking around to hear these kind of more serious streams that I do, because I do feel a certain level of social responsibility when I read this kind of insanity. to help people understand it and to help people realize what it's like out there. In the meantime, gentlemen, I will stop procrastinating. Good stream. Thank you very much, damned lurker. You damned lurker! How dare you! I actually do think a couple of people have subscribed during this stream too, which is quite interesting. Yeah, latest subscriber, Demon Boy 007. My goodness, there's a mid-2000s Xbox name if ever I did see one. But welcome aboard, my friend. Hopefully the next stream will be, maybe if not a bit more positive, then at least a bit more interesting. I understand if, like, dry read-throughs of medical publications are not particularly interesting for some people. But again, I'm very grateful for the people that actually did stop around and listen to this with me. Thoughts on Sayu statements? I have not even really read them. I think I did read them, but I don't have them in my head, so that's something that I could cover on Wednesday, actually, because I am interested in what Sayu has to say, but at the same time, when can a channel have YouTube memberships? When can you need more? A channel must be in the YouTube Partner Program, have more than 30,000 subscribers, and have 0 policy strikes. So yeah, guys, all I need is another 30,000 subs. So how do I enable memberships on YouTube? See, I need a fair number more subs, so you're not going to get them anytime soon, sorry. But anyway, for now, guys, I'm going to log off, and I'm going to see you later. I'll be back on Discord in a few minutes, so I will see you all there. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you will stick around the next time I do a stream.